Hi everyone, I'm David Utes. I'm the Executive Director, and welcome to Yale China Association. Thank you for turning out. We have a very interesting presentation and conversation today, and this is actually the second time I've been on stage with Lev. We did a rather different presentation in Beijing about 3 or 4 months ago, and Lev was one of our various examples of Yale China Fellows and the really interesting ways that they are intersecting their lives and their careers. So we were presenting to an all Beijing audience, and I think the theme was how your life is going along and you encounter Yale China and it heads in interesting different directions. So Lev is a great example of that. Lev, interestingly, unlike many of our fellows, is not a Yale product himself. He's a Reed College graduate. But he encountered Yale and Yale China at a certain point, and I hope he'll agree things got very interesting and took a new direction. So thank you for joining us today. Lev's talk is a very long title. I apologize for that. His title is Swimming Upstream, Teaching a Required Bible Studies Class and Conducting Research on the Cultural Revolution at Central China Normal University, 2016-2017. So that packs a lot in. And we'll let Lev do the explaining about how Bible stories and the Cultural Revolution and an array of other things all come together. Lev was what we call the Guizishan Fellow last year. This is a relatively new program that you may not have encountered. Most of you, I think, are familiar with our regular fellowships for recent graduates of Yale, and we place them at 4 different partner schools, some high schools, some universities in China and in Hong Kong. The program Lev was on is a slightly different animal, which we call the Guizishan Fellowship. Guizishan is the name of part of the campus at Huazhong Normal University, or CCNU in Wuhan. It's another longtime partner that we've worked with at Yale China over the decades. But this program in particular is an experimental version. So it's somewhat different in its structure and its purpose. And we have now had 5. 2 have just arrived about 2 weeks ago in Wuhan. We had 2 the first year, and Lev was our Guizishan Fellow in the middle year. It's experimental in the sense that they are there with a part-time teaching assignment, but the more significant reason for being on campus is to do research and to work alongside an academic department and to contribute to that department. So I think that is equal parts of what Lev is going to describe as how that experience went this year and the ways in which that got interesting and was a little unpredictable. Lev is a graduate of Reed College of 2015.
2012, actually.
Oh, it's 2012. Okay. Yes, that does make more sense. Because I know that after Reed, Lev worked in Beijing for a couple of years, so that makes more sense. Lev is also the grandson of Francis Wei, and some of you will recognize that name. He was one of the most important educators in the 20th century in China. Wei Zhoumin, and he was the first Chinese president of Huazhong Normal University, or CCNU, president from 1929 to 1951. So I will let Lev talk a little bit more about how all these threads come together. Let me just mention a couple of special thank yous. I first want to thank 3 people who are here in the audience. Terry Lotz has joined us. Terry, as some of you know, is a former chair of the board of Yale China and a longtime friend. He's been involved with various different roles and is currently at Syracuse University. And Terry got involved because he likewise shares an interest and has written academic papers on Francis Wei. And so they came together early in this story. And I wanted to say a particular thank you because Terry served as an advisor and an important link and supporter of Lev's project this last year. Likewise, I want to pass a thank you to Deborah Davis, next to Terry. Deborah also served as an advisor to Lev in the course of his year. And I think all of you know Debbie is here at the sociology department, a longtime specialist in China issues, and also a longtime member of the Yale China board. And a final thank you. You'll notice the bright lights. I want to thank Lev's father, Wilson, who is a documentary maker and is going to be officially recording this conversation. So thank you for the setup and for the tape, and we'll let you know where this is streaming at some future point. So thank you, and please welcome Lev Navarre.
Should I stand? Should I sit?
However you'd like to do.
Well, if you folks don't mind, I'll remain sitting. It's a little easier for me. I titled this talk Swimming Upstream, which is sort of a silly metaphor, I suppose, but it's meaningful for me because almost the entire process of interacting with Yale China, and especially of going to Wuhan to not only teach, but also to do research, has been very much a process of my investigation of, well, who am I and where do I come from? I'm going to first explain a little bit about my background, which I promise you is not a vanity project, but is relevant every step of the way. And then I will share with you some fun photos and details of the types of teaching that I did at this university. And then I'll shut the photos down and I'll proceed to talk about the type of research I did for which there is not necessarily any photographic evidence. I was born in Boston, and I was, some of you will recognize my dad in this photo. I was born in Boston, and I was raised in Newton, Massachusetts, both Jewish and Chinese. Well, what does that mean? What that means is that I just sort of knew. My mom is Jewish, and therefore I am Jewish, and my dad is Chinese, and so therefore I am Chinese. I didn't really see a contradiction. There were plenty of classmates in Newton public schools who were of full or partial Jewish and or Chinese descent. This is the same family, but you can clearly see the Chinese grandparents in the background, calligraphy, etc. I didn't actually have much upbringing in terms of traditional Chinese culture. I had lessons in Hebrew, I prepared for a bar mitzvah, but for some reason, my grandparents didn't speak Chinese with me, nor with my dad, who does not speak any Chinese, either Cantonese or Mandarin. I didn't really question that, not only because as a child I didn't really have the wherewithal to ask, Dad, why don't you speak additional languages? It was just sort of a part of my upbringing. So I had some exposure to China. We can see here a family trip with some friends, and I'm looking very surly up top. That's a fairly accurate reflection of my engagement with China at that time, right? There's sort of a general engagement, but a disinterest. My sister is laughing at me, of course. But I mostly engaged with my Jewish background. I was immersed in the holy texts. I had a very serious bar mitzvah. At one point, I went to Jerusalem and I engaged in what's called yeshiva studies, in which I learned Jewish law, the Gemara, etc. I've since backed away from that lifestyle. You can see I'm neither wearing a yarmulke, nor do I have my beard. But my engagement through my mid-20s, or early 20s rather, was almost entirely in terms of what is my identity. I am primarily Jewish with Chinese characteristics, right? And my engagement with Chinese culture didn't really arrive until later, when I was attending Reed College and I took first year Chinese. To this day, I'm not really sure why I took first year Chinese. It was just interesting. The language was interesting. The characters were interesting. It was really hard. I mean, it was really hard. And I kept going, and it came time for, as all Reedies must do, I had to write a senior thesis. And I struggled for a topic. I was functionally within the division of literature, and so I had to write on some form of Chinese literature. But at that time, during the winter, when I was trying to come up with the topic, my grandmother said to me, Lev, well, you're here in Boston, not on the West Coast for winter break. As long as you're here, would you mind going down to New Haven and digging up a box of my dad's papers? Okay, fine, no problem. It's a box of your dad's papers. It's in New Haven. This is very simple. It's very obviously a shoebox in a shelf somewhere, and it will be simple to It probably has pictures in it, right? Something like that. So I came down to New Haven, and I discovered via the Yale China Association and Nancy Yao Mosbach, who was the director at the time, several thousand pages of documents written by Francis Wei as the president of Huazhong College to the administrators at the, then I think it was the Yale in China Society, no longer Missionary Society, but it was Yale in China. And I realized that I had a thesis topic on my hands. Now, to give you a little bit of perspective, this is me just a few years prior holding my grandfather's doctoral diploma. He went to Columbia Teachers College and he received his degree in education, and he actually wrote his thesis on the linguistic difficulties of teaching English to native speakers of Cantonese. And you can see again, I'm not particularly engaged. It's a novel object, but I had no idea where it was going to lead me. And here we see my grandfather and my grandmother. And maybe you can recognize here, this is my father, very obviously. Right? So my grandmother is the one who has the blood link to Francis Wei. This is her sometime in the mid-40s. This photo is undated. I believe on the then recently returned to Wuhan campus of Huazhong University, but I am unsure. I recently received these photos from a relative. And here in the middle, here she is as a young girl. And I think this, I don't know when this photo was posed for, maybe in the mid-30s. And we can see Francis Wei on the top right. We can see his wife in the middle left, and we can see the other three siblings all around. So this is the person whom I discovered I was related to, my great-grandfather. And I didn't really understand the significance of his life and his impact on modern Chinese society until I was to continue digging into his writings. I took these thousands of pages of documents that I had right back to Reed College, and I said to my department chair, I know what I want to do for my thesis. And he said, that's very interesting, but you're going to need to switch your major to history, because we, the Chinese department, are within the division of languages and literature. So I didn't change my major. What I did do was I applied for and I received a fellowship over the summer between my junior and senior year, and I investigated Francis Wei's early writings. I'll return to this later on in the talk. Functionally, Francis Wei was raised in the late 1890s and educated in the Confucian classics in order to become a bureaucrat within the structure of the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty didn't last tremendously long after the 1890s. It eventually collapsed in 1911, but about a decade prior to that, early 1900s, Francis Wei's father, who was a rice merchant, saw the writing on the wall and decided to put his son, Francis, into a missionary school, to switch streams, so to speak, from emerging in the holy text, if you would, of Confucianism to the holy text of Christianity. And he attended the Boone School, which fed into Boone College, a missionary institution. And he received his bachelor's degree in 1908 from Boone College, and he wrote his undergraduate thesis on the similarities between early Chinese concepts of deities and the Judeo-Christian concept of God. He published it in 1908. It was written both in English. He also translated it into Chinese. His function at that time, when there was relatively little interchange, one-way missionary interchange, but relatively little mutual exchange on comparative religions, his contribution was to identify, especially to missionaries, how the Chinese concept of the supreme is not at all that different from the Western concept. And there's not a need to treat the Chinese like barbarians in the process of proselytizing. His 1915 master's thesis made the argument that the foundational Confucian text of the Mencius, the Mengzi, actually anticipated the second coming of Jesus. Now, there are some problems with his arguments, but nevertheless, he was a great scholar, and I respect that work very much. And the goal is also interesting. He was preparing the Chinese in the other direction to eventually receive the teachings of Christianity. He was creating a vision by which the then chaotic but nascent modern Chinese state, a nation state, could form a new identity that was able to synthesize both Western ideologies and religions and worldviews, and also its traditional Confucian worldviews. That vision did not come to light. It was hopeful, but there were other more powerful forces at work. The May 4th movement, and especially the New Culture movement, fought back in many instances against the powers of Westernization. And Francis Wei was caught a little bit in the middle. So in 2011, I came with my grandmother, who is now 95, she can't make it tonight, this evening, to the 110th anniversary of the Yale-China Association. And it was at that point that I realized that I was going to have a relationship with Yale-China, regardless of whether or not I had attended Reed College, and really regardless of whether or not I completed my thesis. Thankfully, I completed it, but. In 2013, I was working in the Boston area. I graduated from Reed College. I had a degree in Chinese literature, and nobody hired anybody with degrees in Chinese literature. So I was working as an SAT tutor. And Nancy, who was the director at the time, asked me to come down to a meeting at which Yale China and the leadership of Central China Normal University brokered a new arrangement for what would later become the Guizishan Fellowship. And I did not realize it at the time, but one of the reasons for my presence there was to provide a biological proof of the past legacy cooperation between these two institutions. And I had no idea what was happening at that meeting. My Chinese just wasn't good enough. They were negotiating at the speed of light. But eventually, when I found my way to Beijing, two people, two dear friends. On the right we have Anita, and on the left we have Alice, who is with us here today. When I was in Beijing a year and a half ago, Anita approached me and suggested that I apply for this particular fellowship. And at the time I was teaching SAT and ACT prep in Beijing, and it just sounded like a dream come true to be given the funding to go upstream, to swim upstream to the spawning grounds, right? And to investigate my heritage at the source. Anita and Alice were very helpful, and they actually helped me to investigate and go line by line through several contracts. One contract, which had been sent to me by the publishing house of this university, asked me to accept some royalties from the forthcoming publications of the anthology of Francis Wei's writings. And I couldn't read it. I mean, I'd majored in Chinese, but I couldn't read a legal document regarding royalties. And Alice went through it line by line, and she said, Lev, the very first sentence here asks you to accept full responsibility for any politicized contents of the upcoming 11-volume anthology. And I took her advice and I didn't sign it. And I was able, nevertheless, to go on to Central China Normal University and participate in this fellowship. What happened was that during preparation for this fellowship, when I was attending orientation in Hong Kong at the New Asia College, with which Yale China has a long-standing relationship, I received an email from the administrator at the university, and it said, we're planning which courses you might want to teach this upcoming year. Would you be comfortable teaching a course on 20th century history that follows Francis Wei's life? And I thought, no, I will not be comfortable with that. And the reason I would not be comfortable with that is because all of the historical sources with which I am familiar are primarily written in English and are published by Western presses and are quite openly critical of the party and of the current government. And I wasn't going to put myself or Yale China in a position where, in order to maintain the academic integrity of my class, I had to censor material that informed the history of my students' parents and grandparents. I wasn't going to do that. So I declined to teach that class. I demurred. I was very polite about it. The administration immediately got the message, realized I wasn't comfortable, and counter-offered with teaching Bible stories. I didn't really know what to do about that either, but I wasn't going to refuse a second time in 48 hours, so I said, sure, why not? I'll figure it out, right? It turned out to be a perfect match. And it turned out to be a perfect match because I was eventually given fairly broad leeway to determine which text I would teach. And since I had been learning the text of the Torah, the Old Testament, since I was a child, I was very, very intimately familiar. I had my preferred translation into English. I knew what I was going to do. It would be hazardous, a little bit, politically anyway, but I went for it. So, well, before I get into the grading practices, I had specific goals for this course. My mandate was functionally to teach large swaths of the text of the Old Testament and the New Testament to sophomore English majors at a national university. And I would have about 100 students broken up into 3 classes. Now, there are a number of different problems with this, not to mention the numbers. But one of the primary problems was, what are the goals for the class? Well, a couple of goals. If they're within the English department, they need to learn to be better readers and to be better writers. Better readers, I mean, it's not as if reading the Bible is standard reading of a novel now, is it? Or an expository essay. I mean, it's tough stuff to read no matter your native language. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. A second goal is that I wanted my students to learn to grapple with the text on their own and to learn to think critically and to defend their arguments in writing. It's reading the 2 sides of the coin of literacy. And the third goal was that I didn't want to get in any trouble. So what I did was I put together a structure by which my students would read the text both in Chinese and also in English. And the English translation that I chose was actually my favored translation from the copies of the Torah that I'd read growing up in my home synagogue. And I went online and I found the text and I copied and pasted the whole thing into a PDF so that I wouldn't wind up sending my students en masse links to Bible stories online and be accused of God knows what. And then what I did was I walked the students through the stories using paintings and audio. And my goal was not for them to necessarily analyze at a deep level, although I was very happy to see that later on they would do that. My goal was for them to simply understand who says what to whom and who does what and goes where. Because I think that for most of us it's difficult to keep that straight, right, in the text of the Old Testament. And if these students could do it, it'd be great. So then the question was, how am I supposed to grade them? Well, if I wrote the homework assignments for them, there would be a right and a wrong answer. And then they're just going to try and figure out what I want them to say. And I'm back to almost a missionary position. So I can't do that. So I had to give them agency over controlling their own homework assignments. So I set up a structure whereby we'd read the text for 1 week. And on the second week, we would review the stories, look at paintings relevant to these particular stories, and the students would have discussion amongst themselves. And after those discussions, the students would come up with questions that they had about what doesn't make sense. And there's plenty that doesn't make sense in the text. And they would choose their own questions for the assignment due the following week. It was a 3-week cycle. And the way that I graded them was to give them up to 60% if they just repeated what happened in the story. Just read the text, kid. I don't care if you read it in Chinese. I don't care if you read it in English. Just read it. An additional 20% was for writing in English that I could read because, well, it's English class and they need to write according to the rules of standard English. And also it's a giant pain in the rear to grade 100 poorly written essays. So I wanted to give them the incentive to write it properly. And the last 2 both gave some students wings and also led to some students being pretty scared. I would give them up to 90% if they added their own interpretation. If they could come up with one interpretation of the text on their own that went beyond the text and could prove it according to the evidence in the text. And the only students who could earn 100% on a regular basis in the homework assignments were those who considered more than one interpretation of the text, chose which or neither or both interpretations could be reasonably defended, and eventually, using textual evidence, defended their choice of which judgment was most appropriate. So let's take a look at some of the things that they wrote, because this really, I think, is the meat of the experience of teaching is, well, what do the students get out of it? So here are some of the questions that the students generated after reading for 1 week the story of the Akedah, God's instruction for Abraham to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. And these are the questions that they came up with. So I'll read some of them to you. Was the instruction by God to Abraham to sacrifice his son an honor or a blessing, or was it a punishment? If it was a blessing, who was being blessed? Did Abraham know how much God knew about him? Did he know that it was just a test? And if he knew that he was being watched by God and being tested, was he just pretending to sacrifice a member of his family to show his loyalty? Let's take a look at some of the ways that I graded some of these students. The students had a terrible tendency to just skip over the evidence. They really loved phrases like, everybody knows, or science has proven, or a wise man once said. Right? All right, so, as you can see, I inked right over it and I said, show me the text, kid, right? Some interesting interpretations of God, whom I presented as a character, came forth. Many of the students had sort of heard general ideas from Christianity and ideas of God as benevolent and kind and giving rewards to good people. And this student says, in short, God is an almighty, kind, but a little authoritarian old man. And I actually think that's a very apt characterization of the God of the Old Testament. I think that's not that far off the mark. Good job. This student, who is hilarious, in writing about Jacob's difficulty dealing with his two wives, Leah and Rachel, writes, if you have more than one wife, you will be desperate for harmony. I mean, she gets it, right? Yeah, so God helps you, right? She gets it, right? Good job. And here is an example of some of the paintings that I showed them in order to sort of push them to accept that it's all right to grapple with multiple interpretations. This is a Caravaggio, I believe, painting of the sacrifice of Isaac, of the Akedah, and I think it's dated 1603. And what I asked the students when I presented this is, according to this interpretation, Caravaggio's interpretation, and we can trust him because he's a famous painter and he's really good, so therefore his interpretation must be very trustworthy, right? According to this, does Abraham intend to kill Isaac? Yes, no, I don't know, maybe so, right? You know, we can look at different things, you know, the attitude of the hands, you know, whether or not Isaac is actually tied up very tightly, stuff like that. This is, I don't know if I'll pronounce this correctly, Domenichino. Plus or minus 25 years of the initial Caravaggio. And I asked again the same question. In this painting, does Abraham actually intend to sacrifice his family member? And some students said yes, and some said no, and some said he's just putting on a show. Look at his dramatic body language. I'm going to do it. Are you going to stop? I'm going to do it, right? This is Rembrandt. Almost every student said that they thought that Abraham was really going to do it at this point. This one is Caravaggio 4 years after the first one. Same painter. Yeah? Let's go back a little. 1, 2, 3. Caravaggio 1603. 1607, I believe. And so what I was trying to demonstrate to the students is that even amongst serious scholars of the text, interpreters of the text, it was a reasonable thing for them to interpret the intents of the characters in multiple different ways. And for the ambiguity of the dynamics between an authoritarian figure, between a father and a son, or a mother and a daughter, between a parent and a child, to be ambiguous and up for interpretation. Oh, this is a little unclear. One of my favorite students wrote this response. It's a little difficult to see, I apologize for that. But functionally, she draws a flowchart in which the first premise is, can God read one's mind? Right? And then she says, well, if yes, does Abraham know that? And if yes, then this. And if no, then that. And if God can't read one's mind, then what does God think, or what does he feel? Now, that in itself is a reasonable way to approach the assignment. She writes she doesn't know and requires further study, which is actually a fairly brave thing for a Chinese student to say in a homework assignment. I don't know requires further study. But what really makes it interesting is in the middle of the first paragraph, she quotes George Orwell and 1984. She writes, I remember that in George Orwell's 1984, the hero says they can supervise us, but they can't dig into our mind and read our thought, unquote. And then she puts in parentheses, ha ha, I translated the sentence by myself. Very cute, right? But the point is that at this relatively early stage of teaching Bible studies, some of the brighter students in the class are A, coming to the conclusion that there are no clear answers when it comes to knowing how much an authority figure knows about them, and B, she's connecting it with Western literature that is highly critical of fascism and authoritarianism. And that was the second indication that I had that something was afoot in terms of the relationship between students and the administrations, at the very least at that university, and at the very least regarding control of information. I said it's the second indication because the first indication was the contract that I was given that Alice told me not to sign, which asked me to take responsibility for any political content of that publication. But here's something a little bit more lighthearted. Throughout the course of the semester, these students took pictures of me, and I didn't realize they were doing it. I thought they were taking pictures of the PowerPoints that I was giving. And here I am, and there is my colleague, Emily Stanevicius, and we can see that they took a picture of us candidly and laid over text, making fun of how much snacks we were eating. And so it wasn't all death and destruction and does God know our thoughts. Here's another one. The joke here is that by far the most common comment that I would write in the margins of my students' homework assignments was interesting. And so anyway, thanks kids. This basically says this young student has an innocent flirtatious face, and I am saying, speak up, my ears are not so good, right? This one says, time to get a divorce. I'm not exactly sure what it means. I don't get it at all. But the students thought it was hilarious, so I'll just give it to them. And here I am as a dog. Yeah. So we had fun in that class. It came to the point where, at the very least, they trusted me enough to show me the photographic evidence that they were making fun of me. And that was so endearing because I correlated with their willingness to write assignments without fear that I would punish them or hurt them for their opinions. So one of the things that I want to share with you is some of the writing that they produced. Alice has a stack here. You can just disseminate these freely. So these essays are essays that the students produced for the midterm. And in the midterm essay, some of these students really, really blossomed. I gave them 3 choices, and all of them were hard. The first essay prompt was, explain the system of justice found in the Bible. Well, I don't know that I could explain that, but that was their assignment, so they did it, right? The second was for them to pick a historical event or a series of events in Western history, and I say specifically after 500 BCE because I don't want to deal with pre-Roman Empire stuff. And I asked them to explain how the Bible stories may have influenced the decisions of individuals in Western history. And you'll see that one of the students in here cited passages from both the Old and the New Testament in order to justify after the fact the Third Crusade, which I thought was a brilliant step forward for a sophomore English student at a Chinese university. One of the other students in there makes the argument, she found out about the multiple authors theory of the Old Testament, and she makes the argument that the actions of the character of God throughout the Old Testament in Genesis and Exodus are absolutely consistent if one considers that God's primary mission is to maintain control over humanity, and he loses control of the narrative moving forward. It makes sense how he applies his power. That was just mind-blowing to me that she was able to come up with that. And I think maybe one of my favorite essays in there was written by a student who traced the influence of the New Testament on a novel written by the May 4th author Lu Xun in his novel called Medicine, or Yale. And I was just really proud of them. So the midterm went fairly well. I caught a couple students plagiarizing. they just couldn't believe it when I failed them. It just like, it was mind-boggling to them that they would be punished for having copied from other students, which was a little surprising to me because I'd given very explicit lectures saying plagiarism is not okay. There's a value. I mean, we're working on the honor system because if we can't trust each other to not steal each other's works, then there's very little incentive for scholars to create new knowledge. Why would you do it if you knew it was going to be stolen? They understood the rules. Some of them broke it anyway. But on the whole, most of them soared, and I felt very, very successful in terms of my ability to teach them to think critically. And I wrote some memes back. I took some pictures of them suffering through the final, right? So they just looked so miserable, but I loved them for it. I told them there would be multiple choice. There wasn't any multiple choice. So anyway. All right. So this I'm gonna skip over the next image. I know you can't read it from here. The reason that I want to talk a little bit about this final essay, because this was not a midterm essay. This was a regular homework assignment, the last of the semester, after I had taught the second half of the Gospel of Matthew, including the trial of Jesus of Nazareth and the crucifixion. And this particular student wrote this essay and turned it into me at the end of the year. And I'm going to read this part to you. In her final paragraph, she writes, or her second to final paragraph, she writes, "When I am reading the part of the whole process of the crucifixion of Jesus, I associated it with one period of horrible history in China, a revolution called Mao's Revolution, or the Great Cultural Revolution. I want to write more details about it and compare this two things, but I am not able to know too much about it, even from the internet. All the torture which Jesus had suffered," and then she cites Matthew, "were a lot like the suffering Chinese intellectuals had undertaken during this revolution, wearing a red hat, being denounced, being mocked by crowds. During this horrible time, many intellectuals chose to commit a suicide in order to escape those dreadful humiliation. They were the same noble as Jesus, and they undertook those humiliation and death as him. However, Jesus has risen. Those innocents who were died in the revolution could never open their eyes again. Lev, maybe you can ignore this part, for this revolution is a rather sensitive topic in China. I hesitate for a while, but I finally write them down." So this was a bombshell to me for a number of different reasons. The first is that it is tremendously brave, even reckless, for a student to openly mention the Cultural Revolution, not to mention to compare the martyrdom of Jesus to those Chinese intellectuals. She really took a tremendous risk. And I got quite emotional when I read it because, I mean, she got it, right? She was able to connect her most paradigmatic example of human suffering, needless suffering and sacrifice, with the most with the paradigm of Western martyrdom, right? So she had connected, and yet I could tell by her writing that she was afraid of expressing it. So I spoke with her afterwards, and I mean, of course, I gave the essay an A, but that's beyond the point. I told her it was a brilliant connection, and I asked her if, were I to anonymize that essay, if I could share it with my superiors and with my colleagues back home, because it was just such a stellar example of connecting history with foundational texts. And at first she sort of hesitantly agreed if I redacted her name. And then she got back to me a week later and she said, "You know, Lev, I spoke with my parents about it. They're party members, and they instructed me to tell you under no certain terms that not only you should not share it, but also I would like you to burn the paper copy that you have." And I did. And I sent her this photo. Because although I am sharing this with you, and although it is tremendously indicative of the abilities of the brightest students at mainland Chinese universities, I have no idea how much trouble she can get into. And she can't be the only one, right? She's just the only one who wrote about it. So that's all the photos that I have to tell this story. And I think that this one is particularly poignant because I didn't realize it at the time, but this particular relationship with knowledge and the creation of knowledge and the destruction of knowledge, especially regarding Western influences, would foreshadow what happened to me in the second semester. So that's the end of the first semester. In order to continue with my experience during the second semester, during which I focused on research, I need to back up a little bit in order to explain the context of what I intended to research, the materials I had on hand, the types of materials I hoped to find. I previously described some of Francis Wei's earlier writings, which were functionally written in an era, I don't want to say of totally free press because nothing's ever really truly free everywhere, but a pretty good time in Chinese history, up until roughly 1950. I have plenty of Francis Wei's writings, and I am able to trace with a good amount of detail using the published records and the archives from Yale, China, and from the Divinity School, and from Harvard Yenching and several others, the history of this man's life. But after 1950 and 1951, what happened to Francis Wei was tremendously unclear. Now, we can trace a couple of different sources. We can look at what happened to Chinese intellectuals during that time period, broadly speaking. We can even look at the official biography of Francis Wei published by CCNU in 2010. The problem with that is that some of the years in his life contain only one paragraph of narrative, and some years contain no narrative at all. So my goal was really to find out what happened to Francis Wei and what happened to him during the Cultural Revolution. He was a perfect target for a number of different reasons. He was Western educated, he was an intellectual, he was Christian, he was a faculty member and administrator. Take your pick of why he would have been held up for persecution. But my goal was to find out what happened to him when the trail, at least in English, went dead. Pretty much the last missives that Yale China had from him were in about 1950, more or less a year after the Communist Party victory over the Nationalists, in which he wrote that he was tremendously hopeful that the new government would be supportive of the existing educational structures, would permit freedom of curriculum, would not permit students to interfere in faculty affairs and administrative matters, and that the new government would support freedom of religion. Francis Wei was very, very, very hopeful. Now, none of the things that I described actually happened. Exactly the opposite of all those things happened over the next couple decades. But what I had was a last series of missives indicating his mindset in 1950. And what I wanted to do was find the sources and, if possible, the living witnesses to interview in order to gather information on what happened in the 50s, the 60s, and 70s. And I pretty much entirely failed. Initially, I was received very, very well by the institution. Early in September, at the beginning of the semester, I was invited to attend the publication of Wei Zhuomin Quanzi, the anthology publication of Francis Wei's works. It was 11 volumes, it was huge. I had a seat at the table, I said a couple words, mostly thank you, thank you, thank you. And I shook a couple of scholars' hands, including some highly influential historians. I'm thinking specifically of Zhang Kaiyuan, who was a very influential historiographer. I was the recipient of goodwill and future introductions to those who were familiar with Francis Wei when he was alive. Not many, but some still were living. And throughout fall semester, I mostly focused on my teaching. I attended a couple conferences and seminars, but my research didn't really pick up until, I'd say, the second month of second semester, March. I got my first big break when I was invited to go to the archives of CCNU. And on the first day there, guided by one of Yale China's friends, I was given access to a box of documents, nondescriptly labeled, I forget the number on the box, and I was allowed to look through. And the handwriting in some instances was quite elegant, and in some instances was quite shaky. But all the documents in that box were signed by Francis Wei, and they were dated 1968 and 1970. I wasn't able to read all of them, not only because of the combination of, simplification of characters hadn't occurred by 1968, and some of the terms that were used in those documents were quite jargonistic. They were technical terms, mostly popular during the Cultural Revolution. And in some instances, his handwriting was shaking so bad that I just couldn't make heads or tails of it. But I knew that these documents were significant when I looked through and I saw that Francis Wei had named many well-known names throughout the Yale China community. Hume, Lyford, Weigel. They were named there. The institutions were named, and they were named in English. And I looked at the title of the documents, and they were all titled My Confession, or Supplementary Materials to My Confession, or Addendum to My Confession. And based on the time period, I knew that whether intentionally or not, the archivist had given me access to materials that would allow me to trace some of the worst parts of Wei's life. I was allowed to see those documents maybe one more time, and then I was never allowed to see them again. I did manage to gather some of their contents. I managed over the summer, with the help of some Yale China staff, to coordinate with the transcriber and a translator and translate some of them. But what happened before I managed to transcribe them was that I tried time and time again to set up interviews with anybody who would know Francis Wei's story, with his contemporaries, including the still living professors and chancellors emerita at CCNU, including his former graduate students, including my own family members. I traveled to Zhuhai in the south of China to Francis Wei's ancestral home in order to interview them, and nobody was talking to me. The people who would speak with me were those who were specialists in Francis Wei's life prior to the Cultural Revolution, those who had compiled the stories of students living in the campus of Huazhong University in Yunnan province, or those who focused on other works that existed outside the Cultural Revolution. At one point, I had a meeting planned with Francis Wei's first graduate student of logic, and on the day that we were scheduled to meet, something came up and she never rescheduled with me. And I was wondering what's going on here. And it took me a while I'm slow, but I'm not that slow. It took me a while to realize that I was being cut off from my sources, although I had been afraid that that would be the case the whole time. And eventually one of the archivists, she sat me down and she explained it to me. She said, according to modern Chinese law, all archives older than, I forget if it's 30 or 40 years, all archives older, Debbie, which is it? Thank you. All archives, academic archives, city archives, whatever, older than 40 years are open to the public. Of course they're open to the public, that's the law. However, politically sensitive material is not open to the public because it's politically sensitive. What years are politically sensitive? Well, roughly 1957 until now. Right? So, because the archives are open to the public, I'm allowed access. Because it's politically sensitive, I am not allowed access. Because he's my ancestor and these are family documents, I am allowed access. Because he was labeled as a counter-revolutionary, and therefore I am part of the family of a counter-revolutionary, I am not allowed access. So, there was, I think, in my interpretation, the university had, and the historians within it, had full knowledge of the various different ways by which Francis Wei suffered at their own hands and at their predecessors' hands. The archives were there, how could they not know? And in my interpretation, the university could not get anywhere close to identifying the horrors that the party visited upon the entire country in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. but they wanted nevertheless to recognize the legacy of one of the founding scholars of the school. So the publication of the anthology, which is squeaky clean, mentions difficult times in '68 or being labeled a this or a that in 1957, avoids all mention of the Cultural Revolution, although everybody except for me seemed to know exactly what happened. It's still unclear to me to what extent I was given access, to what extent I was denied access, and to what extent I was permitted access until the point at which I acknowledged that I had been given access. This is unclear to me. And I think that the way that the student identified the issue of does Abraham actually know if he's being tested, I think there are some parallels there. There's one other series of events that brings us up to the close of the second semester, at which point I had more or less dead-ended in terms of conducting and recording interviews and gathering and at least on-site transcribing material, which is throughout the fall semester, in addition to teaching, I had held office hours and I had attended English language practice circles around campus. And during my office hours, those students who basically just wanted the extra practice or just interested to ask me questions about the West would come in and talk. And at the English language circles, which were held on campus outside, I was a bit of a novelty. And many students who were studying science, et cetera, would come over and sort of hog my attention and simultaneously be very excited to practice their English and too ashamed of their poor English, and then I wound up doing all the talking, and I was kind of nervous about it. But there was one point at which some students asked me what I thought about the new American president. And I gave a very frank appraisal of what I thought of the new American president. And there was a little bit of silence because I think that many of those students would never have dared to give such an appraisal of their own leadership. But I didn't care. But the implicit comparison between my ability to criticize my government and their inability to caused a silence around the circle. And I said, well, why are you being silent? And one of them said, we don't want to say the wrong thing. And I said, well, why are you all being silent? Why do none of you speak out? And they all sort of looked at each other. And I told them, I think the reason you're being silent is because although each of you individually wishes to speak, you are all currently censoring each other. It's a group effort. And some of them sort of nodded. One of them sort of raised her hand to speak. And very quickly someone said, let's change the topic. In other words, acknowledging their censorship of each other had to be censored. So, later in the second semester, I was approached by the US consulate in Wuhan, and they invited me to give a talk. And this was part of the consulate's mission to bring Western culture to China. And in the past, they'd coordinated with a cultural center off campus, and they'd, for instance, shown a screening of Star Wars, right? And it took them months and months to get it set up, and it bounced back and forth between the city bureaucracy and the campus bureaucracy. And of course, consular agents are forbidden to step foot on campuses because they're spies, obviously, right? That's sarcasm for the camera, by the way. But I was being invited to give a talk, hopefully, if the coordination would have worked, at this off-campus cultural center. And the consular representative, a gentleman by the name of Mr. Jamie Dragon, which I just think is the greatest name ever. He was running interference for me, and he said, we're not sure about the venue, but you should let your students know you'll give a talk. You should anticipate if it goes through that the venue can seat up to 200. So I alerted all my classes from the prior fall, and I alerted all of my current classes in the spring, total of about 150 students, and whoever else can come, great. And of course, I was crazy scared to give the talk, but whatever. Great opportunity. So that semester I taught classes on Tuesdays and Thursday. On Tuesday, I announced to 2 of my classes that upcoming Saturday, there would be a talk, location to be determined. By late Wednesday night, I had received a message from Mr. Dragon that the venue would not be available. It had been canceled for, I think the typical translation from the Chinese, it had been canceled for various reasons. Okay, fine, whatever. But he said, nevertheless, we'll reschedule and you can do the talk at the US consulate in Wuhan. It'll be a smaller venue, but we can select the crowd carefully and they'll pass the security screening process. It'll be great. I said, fine, great. On Thursday, I walked into class and I told the class that they may have heard that there was going to be a talk that Saturday, but unfortunately it had been canceled, and a couple of students in the class sort of feigned disappointment, but I could tell that they already knew that there wasn't going to be a talk, and I didn't really know what had happened. So after class that Thursday, a couple of students stuck around. And one of them told me in confidence yesterday, that is to say Wednesday, the student leadership called a meeting, a mandatory meeting for all student leaders to attend, and many non-student leaders, just the general undergraduate cohort was there as well. And the primary message of that meeting was, if one attends a lecture given by Lev, it didn't mean class, it meant a lecture, one would have no political future in the party. And the justification for this was that, and what I'm about to say is false, but that was the justification. The justification was that apparently in the past, I had given a talk off campus in which I had shown a map of China that did not include Tibet. And as the result, I had been asked to go to the police station. None of those things ever happened. I hadn't given a lecture off campus at all to date. And I certainly hadn't touched the issue of Tibet. And the only time I'd been to the police station was when I was filling out my visa paperwork. So what's going on there? And why was it that within 36 hours of announcing a talk, time and place still not determined, that these students felt the need to warn each other not to be at this off-campus presentation? I don't really know. I don't know whether or not this particular message originated at the student level, the rank and file, or at the student leadership level, or at the professorial level, or the faculty. I just don't know. But I gave a talk at the consulate a couple weeks later, and some of the students who were in my closest group of office hours attendees came, and it was lovely. It was very nice, and that was sort of a nice send-off. But by the time that I had left Wuhan, I felt defeated in a number of different ways. And I had even sort of wondered whether or not, and I still wonder now, whether or not the ability, or rather the expressed ability, of some of my students from the Bible Stories class to draw parallels between their own sense of suffering and uncertainty about a wrathful God, or their own vague and ill-defined and ill-informed understanding of the Cultural Revolution and Western paradigms for martyrs, whether or not their ability to express that cast me as a dangerous figure within this university. I just don't know. Oh, and they asked me to renew my contract, and I very politely declined. I came home, and I was out of sorts for a couple weeks after coming home. And about a month ago, I managed, with Yale China's help, to have the documents which I had managed to record out of the archive transcribed. And the news is really bad. In 1968 and 1970, Francis Wei, who had all his life been a devout Christian and who had believed in multicultural education very thoroughly, and who had built, even during wartime, even while being bombed by the Japanese, carefully assembled a talented faculty of bilingual educators from across central China. In 1968 and 1970, he labeled his friends as enemies of the state, as imperialists, as capitalists. He named many names throughout the Yale China community and at home. He himself denounced his own tendencies towards Christianity as incorrect and anti-Maoist thoughts. He broke. This doesn't bring me any pride. It also doesn't bring me any shame, although he is my ancestor. The question for me is, as Terry helped me to formulate, is under what circumstances would a person of such brilliance and conviction and accomplishment reverse his stance and sign his name to these documents? And I think that really the only reasonable answer is that this is part and parcel of what we know as the Cultural Revolution, and which some of my students generally know as a difficult time in history, but as Ms. said, she was unable to find more details about it on the internet. So, when I think about the types of dynamics that lead these students to silence themselves and that lead the administration to extend a hand and then recoil when the heat gets to be too much, I sort of have to ask myself, where is the party in all this, right? The straight answer is, I don't know. But I think that from a broad historical perspective, the Chinese Communist Party is in an almost impossible position, whereby it both wishes to claim that it is a new version of New China, that it has moved past the horrors, and that it is engaging in a new, creating a new type of life for its citizenry. And it also has no way to escape Mao's legacy. It can't do both. They are inherently contradictory. The portrait of Mao hangs above Tiananmen. And every year the painting is taken down and it's repainted because the effects of the weather and of the air pollution tarnish Mao's face. But every year they paint it anew, right? In many cases, I think that the best hope for many of my students cannot exist within the mainland. I think that for many of them, their best hope is to escape, literally to escape, to go to another country. I forgot to mention this, but one student of mine, she actually was, she had transferred from another school and she was taking the sophomore Bible stories class as a senior. And she asked me for help applying to outside institutions. And I helped her with some of her applications, and we really, really struggled together because I couldn't tell her what to write, but she didn't really have a strong enough grasp. She was a brilliant student. She happily was accepted to both Oxford and Cambridge, and she is just now starting at Cambridge doing a one-year master's of children's literature studies. She represents one of the success stories. But for the majority of the rest of those students, I am afraid that that maybe they just won't, again, have an opportunity to share with each other their interpretations of foundational texts. I wish I could conclude with something a little bit more hopeful, but the only real thought that I have to offer is that although those within the mainland, those who identify as Chinese, those who look in the mirror and say, I am Chinese, they are not permitted to be the custodians of their own history. They're not allowed to do it. There are some very, very high up who are permitted to know that elder sources exist, that archival material exists. They can talk about it in private, maybe. But there has been a deterioration across the generation of knowledge about almost 3 decades of Chinese history. For instance, when I went to the archives, I asked the elder archivist, what do you know about the Cultural Revolution? She said, well, my parents told me about it, but only in private, and then she sort of shut down the conversation. I asked the junior archivist, who is in her late 20s, oh, look at this year, this is 1957, that's from the 100 Flowers movement, right? And she said, the what now? There's a professional archivist, right? She handles these materials, and she was not able to put the name to the term. She could have been faking it, but if so, she was a really good actress. I think she just didn't know. And when I asked my students who were 20 years old, ish, what they knew about the Cultural Revolution, they said, we're only permitted to know that mistakes were made and they've all been corrected at this point. So when you look from 40, 30, down to 20 years old, that's a very, very rapid degradation of collective memory. It's astoundingly rapid. How much do 10-year-olds know in mainland China? So this citizenry is not permitted to be the custodians of their own history. And if they are not permitted, then we, outside the Great Firewall, have to do it for them. If we don't, it won't survive. It's not a happy burden. It's not an easy burden. And reading these documents alone is just really, really heavy stuff. And I do have some faith that at some point in the future, there will come a new dynasty, right? Qian Han and Tang Song, Yuan, Ming, Qing, Gongchang, Dang Dai, right? The next dynasty will exist at some point, and perhaps in that dynasty, if the records have not been burnt, the next generation of mainland historians can study them. But until then, it's on us, the royal us. That's all I have for you folks. Thank you very much for listening.